On today's episode of Angel's Garage, I perform tons of bodywork and welding on the body of my 1963 Thunderbird and then paint the car back into its original turquoise color. And as always, you're invited to come along with me on my Thunderbird restoration adventure. Let's go! After taking the car down to bare steel in one of my previous videos, it was now a race against the clock to bring the car inside the garage before any rain or other moisture started rusting all the exposed metal. With a storm approaching, there was no time to waste. The car would need to move from the concrete slab it had been resting on in the backyard all the way to the front yard and then into the garage. This was already quite a ways for a car that doesn't run or drive, but since I had pulled off the entire front end of the car for sandblasting, including the steering system and wheels, this would prove to be quite the challenge. So, without the slightest idea of how we are going to do it, me and my dad began the process of moving the car into the garage. The first idea was to set the front end of the car onto a jack and slide it along some boards laid out on the ground. This worked well for about 15 feet, until we had to turn the car. We did not have enough boards to complete the turn, so the jack idea was abandoned. With not many other options, I suggested the silly idea of just picking up the car and moving it. Of course, this was a big, heavy American car from the 1960s, so there was no way we were just going to pick it up and move it. Well, as it turns out, picking up and moving the car actually worked out a-okay, and after about 20 minutes, one minor accident, and questions about why I couldn't have chosen a Volkswagen or a Yugo to restore, we finally got the car into the garage. This is probably the first time in a few decades that this car has seen the inside of a garage. And now with the car inside, I could breathe easier knowing that this car won't flash rust and can now focus on getting it ready for paint. There were three main tasks I'll need to take care of before any paint would be touching the car. For starters, I'll need to take care of a lot of bodywork. Both of the quarter panels were dented up quite bad near the taillights, and the passenger side quarter panel had actually been sideswiped at one point. The sideswipe damaged the steel around the wheel well and also pushed in the raised edge of the body molding along almost the entire length of the quarter panel. Along with the dents, there was also some rust damage on the car that needed attention. The areas around the bottom corners of the rear window had experienced some corrosion, and there are now several rust holes that would need to be patched. The floor of the trunk and battery tray also experienced some corrosion and now had several pinholes that would need to be filled. Last but not least, I was going to replace all the old seam sealer in the car, so I need to scrape up and remove all the old seam sealer throughout the car so it could be replaced with fresh sealer. With no shortage of tasks to do, I decided to go ahead and start on removing the seam sealer. Ford used a thick, tar-like substance as their seam sealer, and they weren't afraid to use it, laying it down liberally on the floor pans, trunk pan, firewall, inner wheel wells, and inside the engine bay. Most of this seam sealer was still in good shape, but I wanted to lay a fresh coat of epoxy down on the steel below it. Besides, if any of this old sealer failed later, I would kick myself for not taking care of it now. So, I began the thrilling job of scraping it up. Using a torch, I heated up the sealer until it was bubbling. Then, using a gasket scraper, I scraped up as much of the sealer as I could. This method worked great for removing a majority of the seam sealer, especially in the areas where it was used more heavily. Things though weren't totally sunshine and rainbows. On top of the transmission tunnel, I removed a long strip of adhesive sealer that had been added by someone else at some point, which was covering up a huge cut. I'm guessing this cut was someone's failed attempt at adding either a manual transmission or a floor shift automatic transmission. But regardless, I was now going to have to add this to my welding list. With all the seam sealer I could remove by hand now gone, I turned to the angle grinder to finish removing the rest. Using a knotted wire wheel, I cut through and removed the remaining sealer in no time. The next item up on the chopping block was bodywork, and as I said before, there will be no shortage of that. I first wanted to straighten the metal out the best I can. Most of these dents were in areas where I couldn't access the backside of the panel, making dent removal with the hammer and dolly impossible. So I instead used a stud welder for most of these dent repairs. Starting on the very back side of the car, I began welding some studs to these very dented up quarter panels. Then, using a slide hammer and a spot dent puller, I began pulling out some of the deeper dents. Next up was a large side swiped area on the passenger side quarter panel. There were several gashes and bends in the steel, and most of them covered a very large area. Using individual studs over here would be time consuming and probably wouldn't be very effective at removing these longer dents. So rather than studs, I used some Magna wire, which are foot-long wire segments with waves in them that are made specifically for pulling out these longer dents. I welded these to a gash behind the passenger door, some dents around the wheel arch, and then to the length of my sunken-in body molding. After welding the Magna wire into place, I then grabbed a claw which is made specifically for pulling on this wire. I got this claw off of Amazon, which is supposed to attach to a slide hammer. Sadly though, the threads on this claw were slightly different than the threads on my slide hammer, so it really didn't work out. Thankfully though, I had an older slide hammer, and while the threads on here were also totally different, that doesn't matter when you have a welding machine. With my new slide hammer and claw ready to go, I began the slow but sure process of pulling out all the damage on the quarter panel. While the stud welder did its best to remove all these dents, there was still a slight but noticeable dent on the front of the wheel arch. The steel here was too strong for the Magna wire, which kept breaking off, so I instead had to resort to a hammer and beating on the backside of the wheel well. The steel was very thick here, thanks to this being the area where the wheel well and the quarter panel met, so it took a bit of work, but eventually I was able to get it a little better. A quick check with the straight edge and my fender skirt showed I had gotten the wheel arch reasonably straightened out. All this beating on the steel did stress it out though, and by the time I was done, I had a nice crack on the quarter panel near the area I was hammering. Okay, let me just add that to the welding list. After all the hammering and stud welding was complete, the body of this car was starting to look pretty good now. The car would be ready for body filler in no time, but unfortunately, the bodywork didn't just end on the outside of the car. Inside the car on the A-pillar where the driver's door mounts to, the steel was all pushed in around the 2 holes for the door hinges. When compared to the passenger side, it became painfully obvious just how messed up this steel was. Of course, why the steel was pushed in like this is a mystery, but regardless, I wanted to fix it. The best way to fix this was to slowly pry up on the steel until it was somewhat straight. Then all I had to do was fill in the cracks with a weld and grind things down. And speaking of welding, it was now time to take care of the rest of the welding needing to be done on the car. I decided to tackle the hard job first, which was patching up all the rust holes around the bottom of the rear window. Most of these holes were small enough I could fill them with a weld only. The larger holes, however, will need to have a patch panel welded in place to help fill things up. It took a lot of welding around these holes, but I was able to get them all filled in, and after a quick grind job, these window corners were looking somewhat decent now. At the very least, they shouldn't leak. I next moved to the floor of the trunk, which had some very small pinholes in it. I quickly filled these holes up, grinded them down, then moved to the cut in the transmission tunnel, which took quite a bit of welding to fill up, but I prevailed and made the floor all one piece again. I then fixed the crack on the quarter panel, which completed all the welding needing to be done. The final area of corrosion I wanted to tackle was the battery tray, which had several pinholes and pitted steel. The steel here was so thin around the holes that I was afraid that any attempt to weld it would just make the holes bigger. So I instead opted to fill these holes with some JB Weld. I spread the JB Weld on just like body filler, and after sanding it down, this repair came out great. Now that all the metal work is complete, I can move on to the final phase of bodywork, adding all the body filler. For this, I'll be using Evercoat Rage Ultra, which is one of the best sanding body fillers on the market. I prep all the areas I'll be applying body filler to by first roughening up the surface with a flap disc on my angle grinder, giving the perfect surface for the body filler to grip to. Following that, I solvent wipe the surface, then add my first round of body filler, doing my best to add filler to every small ding and defect I notice. Once the filler had cured, I then began sanding it down and smoothing things out. I then repeat this process, adding more body filler and sanding it down until I'm satisfied with the finish. One area that would need extra attention was the body molding on the passenger side. While I had done my best to pull this body molding back out, in many areas the molding was now flat with the side of the car instead of having a raised edge. Adding this edge back with the body filler would be quite tricky, as I would need to do my best to keep it straight and even, otherwise it would not look right. After some thinking, I came up with a solution. Using the undamaged edge of my body molding by the door, I was able to trace down the shape of the edge. Then using Autodesk and my 3D printer, I was able to make a body filler spreader with the exact dimensions of the edge. Next, I measured and then marked the area where I'll need to use the spreader. I would use this mark to help keep my reconstruction of the body molding straight. Finally, using 2 strong magnets, I attached a straight edge to the mark I had created, allowing me to run the spreader down the car perfectly straight. With my new spreader system set up, I began adding body filler back onto the quarter panel. I would add the filler in steps, slowly working my way down the length of the car, until I eventually had the entire body molding back in place. It was pretty ugly looking by the time I was done adding filler, but there was definitely an edge starting to become visible again. After sanding down all the body filler, I was left with a redefined edge added back onto the side of my quarter panel. I was now ready to begin the process of applying epoxy primer onto the car. Since the car had been sitting for a while, I decided to go ahead and re-abrade it so the primer would stick perfectly. I pushed the car outside and blasted the inside of the car and the engine bay with the media blaster. I love media blasting because it leaves an excellent surface for primer to bond to, but this is its huge drawback right here: all the cleanup work. After doing my best to sweep up, blow out, and vacuum out all of the blasting media, I then hit the roof and quarter panels with the orbital sander, did a final blowdown of the car, and after I was satisfied that I removed all the debris, I was ready for solvent cleaning. Using my paint gun, I sprayed the car down with a wax and grease remover and wiped the quarter panels and roof down with some solvent wipes. As many of you have probably figured out by now, the 1963 Thunderbird is not a small car. It's so big, in fact, that I decided to lay down the primer in 2 stages. First, I'll apply epoxy in the engine bay inside the main cabin of the car. Then, I'll apply epoxy on the door jambs, trunk, roof, and quarter panels. With no time to waste, I mixed up some Tamco epoxy primer and began laying down the first round of primer. I soon had the engine bay and a majority of the inside of the car in primer. After letting the primer cure for a day, I came back and sprayed the rest of the car. The primer laid down beautifully, and finally, the car was sealed and protected from the outside elements. Once the epoxy dried, I did a thorough inspection to see if I could find any more dents or imperfections in the bodywork. The uniform color and shine from the epoxy makes finding dents very easy, and indeed, I found a few I had missed. Most of these dents were pretty small, with the exception of one larger dent on the inside of the fin. I fixed these by adding an additional coat of body filler over all the dents and then sanding them smooth. I also found 2 areas that would need to be sprayed with more epoxy: inside the cowl and underneath the package tray. Both of these areas were in places that my primary paint gun couldn't easily reach, so I instead turned to a small detail gun from Harbor Freight. The nice thing about this detail gun is I could turn the paint cup upside down, allowing me to access some of the harder to reach places. Better yet, the gun was small enough to fit inside the openings for my air vents, allowing me to spray the inside corners of the cowl. After a short spraying session, the underside of the package tray and inside of the cowl finally had a good coat of epoxy on it. I know a few of you might be asking yourselves, how about the bottom of the car? Ain't I going to spray that with epoxy too? Well, let's just take a quick look underneath the car, shall we? Now, I don't use the word perfect very often, but the bottom of this car is pretty dang close to being perfect. A quick look revealed almost no rust and undercoating that was in mint condition. Given the exceptional condition underneath the car, I decided to just touch up the few small areas of surface rust I found with some rust bullet and leave the rest alone. With all the epoxy primer on the car now, I add a coat of high build primer to the roof and quarter panels, finishing off the priming process. The car is starting to look great now after the high build application, and taking a look at the passenger side, I was able to clearly see the body molding running down the whole side of the car, meaning the bodywork using my 3D printed tool actually worked out. Not bad for something that was printed in 45 minutes. Next up on the agenda was adding new seam sealer to the car. Using some seam sealer and a caulking gun, I began laying down the new sealer inside the car. I laid down a thick bead of sealer to all the areas I removed the old sealer from, and using my finger, I was able to smooth it out. In no time, The inside of the car had brand new seam sealer throughout. I had one more task I wanted to complete before moving on to the next stages of paint, and that was internal frame spray. Using Eastwood's internal frame coating, I went through every channel I could find inside the car and laid down 2 coats of internal frame spray. This coating works great, and that provides an easy solution to protect the internal surfaces of the car, while also treating some of the rust at the same time. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. What's the point of doing a beautiful restoration if it's just going to rust from the inside out? This coating is very messy though, which is exactly why I want to tackle this now before laying down any more paint inside the car. At this point, I was finally ready to begin adding some color to this car. The first area to paint would be the inside of the car, including the cabin and the trunk. None of these areas will ever be seen again, so this paint is just purely for protection. And with that in mind, I decided to go with an easier and more cost-effective PPG single stage to paint the inside of the car. Since I was still within the epoxy's recoat window, I simply sprayed down all the epoxy with a wax and grease remover, and then moved straight into applying paint. My hair was a little blue by the time I was done, but I now had a beautiful paint job inside the cab and trunk of the car, getting me one step closer to the finished product. Moving right along, the next item to paint would be the firewall. I got some runs in the epoxy on the firewall, so before immortalizing these runs forever, I went ahead and sanded them out. Once the runs had been removed, I then taped off all the holes on the firewall, which I soon discovered there was no shortage of, threw a tarp over the rest of the car, and was now ready to lay down some paint. The 1963 Thunderbird featured a black firewall, so my paint of choice, therefore, was Tamco Underhood Satin Black Single Stage, which went down with no issues. With no time to waste, I taped off my freshly painted firewall and prepared the rest of the engine bay to go turquoise. By now, I was nearing the end of my recoat window for the epoxy, so rather than take a chance, I decided to scuff all of the epoxy in the engine bay. I then blew off all the dust and debris, sprayed it down with a wax and grease remover, and shot my first round of base coat and clear coat, finishing off the engine bay and the cowl. The front of the car was looking pretty spiffy now, leaving me with just the roof and the quarter panels to complete. Just before spraying the roof and quarter panels, there was one small area I wanted to take care of. The old undercoating on the inner quarter panels inside the trunk was looking a little neglected and could use some sharpening up. Using a can of Evercoat undercoating, I was able to cover up the existing undercoating with a fresh coat, making this trunk look better than when it left the factory. I began work on the roof and quarter panels by sanding down all the high build primer. High build primer is great for filling in minor defects, and also gives me one last chance to catch any other defects before moving on. I found some very minor dents on the quarter panel, which I filled up and sanded down. Also found a major dent I had not noticed before. On the very front of my passenger side rocker panel, I found a small but very deep gash. The little bit of base coat and clear coat overspray from painting the engine bay had helped highlight this defect. Since this dent was a bit deeper, I wanted to try and pull it out a bit. I sanded down the primer until it was down to bare steel, then using my stud gun, I welded a stud and attempted to pull the steel out. The steel was pretty tough to move, so the stud unfortunately didn't help much. So I just hammered down on the edge of my rocker, which was sticking out a bit, abraded and cleaned up the dent, and then applied some body filler. Once all the sanding was complete, I blew off all the dust and began the process of masking. Using some plastic sheets and tape, I covered up the door openings, window openings, trunk, and lastly, wrapped plastic around my freshly painted engine bay. The last steps now would be going over all the panels with a final solvent wipe and then installing the sleeve nuts. These sleeve nuts are what holds the trim to the side of the car, and after clearing out the holes with a drill, I knocked all the sleeves into place using a hammer. And finally, this car is ready to receive its last coat of paint. I first sprayed a sealer coat over all my panels, and after a final inspection, I was now ready for base and clear. I first masked off the quarter panels and sprayed the roof by itself. Then once the roof was done, I masked off the roof, then sprayed the quarter panels. At long last, this car was back into the color it was when it left the factory. I did an inspection of all the paint once it had cured, and in general, things weren't too bad. I had a wavy section in the clear coat on the side of the roof where I had attempted to remove a run, but this could easily be fixed by wet sanding and polishing it out. What could not easily be fixed though was some minor dents on the passenger side quarter panel. I wasn't expecting the bodywork to be perfect, but there were several of these very small dents all over the place, which was a shame because not only did the paint lay down good, but I had really tried to get this bodywork to be perfect. If it was just a dent or two, I could live with it, but the sheer volume of them convinced me to go ahead and try to redo this quarter panel. With the car in the sunlight, I marked out every single dent I could find, then using sandpaper, I prepped each spot for body filler. I then added body filler back onto the quarter panel and block sanded the filler down. I repeated this process until I was satisfied that all the dents were taken care of. Then I sanded the entire quarter panel down until it was totally smooth. Once the quarter panel was ready to go, I masked off the roof and driver's side quarter panel, did a final wipe, and sprayed down a new coat of sealer. This time, I looked over the sealer very carefully to make sure I could not see any more dents, and once I was happy, I was ready to try turquoise once again. Thankfully, all went well this time, and the quarter panel came out beautifully. And now that the painting process was complete, I pulled off all the plastic and masking tape and added the first parts back onto the car. I think it's fitting that the first parts to be added back onto the car would be the Thunderbird name badges. I got these pieces from the bird's nest, and after shoving them into place, the car was finally, proudly displaying to the world that it was indeed the one and only Ford Thunderbird. Overall, the car was looking great now, and after over a year spent disassembling everything, I can now embark on a new adventure of putting everything back together. Well, that's it for this video. To everyone who's been following along on my video series so far, I'd like to express my deepest gratitude and thank you for your continued support. It really does mean the world to me. And to anyone who might not be already, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. I would really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!